Morning everybody, Phil Henry here from Capricornia Chamber of Commerce. As we've been foreshadowing for the last couple of weeks, we're going to be doing interviews with the candidates for the forthcoming state election for the seats of Rockhampton and Keppel. We've reached out to the candidates, and those interviews that we'll be posting are from those candidates who have got back to us and agreed to do the interview. Each of those candidates will have been given their questions a day in advance. There are 6 questions and they get 2 minutes to answer, and we'll be giving them a little bit of a nod as they're coming to the end of their time. They'll also get a minute at the end just to do a wrap up if they want to do. So without further ado, on to the candidates. So the next candidate we're talking to is Mick Jones. He's the Greens candidate for the seat of Rockhampton. Mick, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, you're right to go with questions?
Absolutely.
Terrific. So the first one, it's become traditional for parties to identify priorities for first 100 days in office. What are your priorities for the first 100 days?
So we've put forward our key campaign initiatives, which include substantial funding for health and education, a massive boost to construction, jobs in housing and renewable energy, and baseline support for families doing it tough in central Queensland, including free breakfast and lunch at state schools for kids in need, a rollout of public housing to clear back the massive backlog, and free sports memberships for kids. That's part of a broad plan to rebuild the economy, particularly in the regions, and ensure the economy works for everyday people and supports the small and medium enterprises that actually provide most of the jobs in the regions. So to do that, firstly, our payment structure. We'll pay for that by making big businesses pay their fair share of support for the economy they reap massive profits from. We'll introduce a levy on the banking industry to offset the implicit subsidy that the Reserve Bank acknowledges that they're making. We'll tax and close a huge loophole that big property developers use when land is rezoned, while giving local landowners an opportunity to have an exemption to that. And we'll raise royalties on the mining industry, particularly the fossil fuel sector, so that more of the value they extract will stay in central Queensland instead of going offshore into tax havens and down south. So to do this, we're going to pursue a balance of power agreement with the Labor Party. We've ruled out a balance of power agreement with the Liberal Party. Their stance on cuts is too high, but we won't be offering any support to the ALP unless they accept the need for real change and move away from the economic model that benefits massive profit taking and doesn't support local businesses and local workers.
So it's a bit of a longer question, so I'll read this one out, but it's a big issue for this part of the world. As identified by Chamber of Commerce and Industry Queensland and the Capricornia Chamber, a business-friendly environment is a key prerequisite for a healthy small business economy. One major concern for regional businesses is the number of institutional barriers that prevent local businesses from being given fair and equitable access to major projects in particular. Many government departments have both published regulations, but of more concern opaque and discretionary internal processes that act as barriers. Given the big number of construction and infrastructure projects on the go in this region, what would you do to fix this problem?
So changing the management of projects is actually really key to all of this. There's a lot of frankly dodgy stuff that goes on in approval and tender processes. There's a lot of backroom influence. Big money and well-connected political players have distorted the process. And we see far too many projects being granted to operators outside the local area and, as you say, outside of a normal tender or approvals process. You know, people are granted approval without a tender process at all. There's all sorts of things going on. And the opaque system serves that agenda. It allows for that level of arbitrary action. Now, I'm not making any formal allegations about that, but there's a lot of money that changes hands in politics. Particularly property development down south has been a big case of that, and we've literally just had a scandal about property developer donations break this morning with relations to the Liberal National Party. So we don't take cash from any for-profit entity, and we don't operate in that world of lobbying. The Greens have explicitly banned all of that, and that gives us a unique opportunity to reform this system, as we've already done with regards to donations to property developers. So we're proposing a big shift in how we plan and fund major projects, and local planning including the establishment of a Queensland Manufacturing Authority, big overhaul of the Planning Act, and a move to publicly owned projects that will work with local providers directly instead of working through layers of subcontracting and tendering that shift funding out of the region and leave local providers of actual services shortchanged and unable to grow. There's a flip side to that, however. We're going to take care of local workers as well. Just off script, look, I think it's very clear that there's a lot of profit taking going on. We have these layers of subcontracting. We have these agreements being struck down in Brisbane or down in Canberra. A lot of big businesses get to leverage their influence over politicians, and the result of that is that local providers can't get a fair deal, but they're also expected to work under all the standards and exacting requirements, of course. So we want to absolutely shift to a model that supports local small and medium businesses and local workers. Yeah, absolutely.
So, what are your infrastructure projects of priority for this region, please, Mick?
So when we talk about infrastructure, we really need to talk about building up the supply lines, resource networks and transportation infrastructure needed to support the industries we need to transition to for the new economy. Now we know that's going to happen and we want to make it happen in central Queensland. So it's not just about how we run coal trains or how we run a lot of road freight. We've got to talk about how these new industries will pop up. Now our proposal is to build a flagship wind turbine factory in Rockhampton and a prototype green steel facility in Gladstone. And key to that is that we will be flagship trailblazing publicly owned projects that will build up the resource network, the supply and transportation network in the area, and that makes it favourable and viable for public-private investment to move into the area. The reality is that you need a bit of public planning to kick off and make those conditions ideal for investment, rather than offering tax cuts and cuts to regulation and poor conditions to workers. So they will be publicly owned and their role is to blaze a trail for private investment in that sector while ensuring that local workers and businesses in the supply line are prioritised. That includes rules for locally sourced manufacturing content for utility scale wind and solar energy projects that will be up to 60% by 2027. So obviously we also support expansion of rail freight as much as possible, sealing of roads, better public transport, better transport for business in general. And it's not a euphemism, it's not a dodge. We actually need to rebuild some of our education infrastructure so that we can actually have people skilling up. We need better support for workers in our area, because if a business can have the best roads in the world, but if the work can't find the workers don't have the skills, the workers don't have the time to do work while also taking care of their kids, then that's a no-goer. So the key for us here is to make sure that we're building those networks of supply, having all that locally sourced, from local businesses and local industries, giving local businesses that opportunity to grow under that umbrella, and with a bit of luck and with proper planning, getting investment to come into the region and take advantage of those supply lines that we've then laid down.
Okey-doke. Next question, Mick. Availability of sufficient affordable baseload power while reducing net emissions from energy sources is a key component of economic sustainability. So what's your view of this objective and how would you achieve it?
So we want to support that with industry right here in central Queensland. The Greens will roll out a massive wind farm project in central Queensland, providing work support for industry and cheap, affordable, reliable power. New renewables with storage are outcompeting coal, gas and other more far-fetched alternatives like nuclear. New solar with storage is cheaper than new coal. That's a matter of fact. For our region, and notably when we talk about reliability, we're talking about dispatchability. And the Queensland Greens feel that in central Queensland our best bet is wind with water storage, because that's a very reliable, very robust approach. You're not on the hook for a bunch of lithium. You don't have to worry about that. We've got really good sites all over eastern Queensland, notably including central Queensland for water storage. Wind does very well. If you have a large enough wind scale, then you've got a lot of reliable power. Solar, you have those big banks and troughs, and honestly coal's not that reliable at the best of times. Coal power plants tend to drop off here and there. So what we want to do is get going on that as soon as possible and making sure it works for people. We don't want a repeat of what happened in South Australia, where everybody went gung-ho, private invested renewable energy projects, but there was no storage infrastructure. And at a certain point you hit peak time, peak demand, and they just ended up having to cycle up a bunch of gas plants to supply that peak dispatchability. So we can solve that. It's been solved in South Australia and we can solve it here. There's sites in Mount Morgan. Short term, there's brownfield sites in Mount Morgan, and longer term we can even look at rehabilitating the mining voids. But there's already mining voids in Queensland being trialled for use as water storage. The mining industry, ironically, is taking to renewable energy with gusto. It's a very reliable way for them to use power. But for the moment, we want to build a path for workers and local businesses in our regions to move into stable long-term work in the industries we're building now. The last thing we want is to bet big on coal again, because that bet will come due, and that won't be good for local industries either. We want these local medium-sized industries to move out of that sector with the assistance of the government.
Next question, Mick. It's become apparent in recent years that the education and skills system, particularly in relation to apprenticeships, has failed to keep pace with the needs of business and industry. What would you do to rectify this situation in this region?
Yeah, so a lot of our members are literally in education. It's very clear that we need to reinvigorate university, TAFE and apprenticeships. Last federal election we moved for full free university and TAFE. There's a lot of talk of having conditional university and TAFE placements based on what business needs, but we know that when we have that approach we tend to run a bit too narrow. We want to have a blanket free approach like we used to, because that allows people to take opportunities, take advantage of opportunities. We know what we're likely to need, But we also know that we've bet big on what we needed in the past, and that led to a generation of kids who had educations and qualifications and they haven't found much to do with them. So we've got to have planning to support those jobs as well as the training to support those jobs. But yeah, we've got a plan to push public school back to fully free. Right now people are paying thousands of dollars just to get their kids into public school. We want to make sure universities are properly supported, TAFE's properly supported. We need apprenticeships too. But to get those apprenticeships going, we're going to need industries, we're going to need actual projects. And we can't rely on, for instance, I've seen other politicians pleading with the Adani Corporation to put on more apprentices or to put on more, clean skins. That's not going to work. We actually need to be able to do that on our own terms, make sure that we're controlling these projects and making sure things like who's being employed on what terms. Labour hire is another factor there, but absolutely we want to make sure we have the projects for those apprenticeships to work on. We're supporting the businesses that are providing for those apprenticeships. Instead of them having to bet on an apprentice, we need to make sure they're fully supported. And that involves spending money, that involves making sure we've got real revenue in those projects. Because if we're just rolling out the red carpet for billionaires, they're just going to do whatever they want. They're not going to hire those apprentices. They're going to want qualified workers and they're going to work them as hard as they can. So yeah, absolutely, the Greens have by far the best policy for support of education in Queensland and federally, and we'll stand by that absolutely.
Okay, Mick, this is the last question. So particularly since the onset of COVID-19, but also reflecting the global marketplace, businesses need to better understand the digital online world and have access to stable, high-speed internet. What are your policies to help local businesses both understand e-commerce and access the digital world?
Look, I think that's a difficult issue because on the one hand we've had multiple successive federal policies which I don't think have gone very well. We're now going back. They're talking about pulling out a huge amount of fibre and fixing some of the dysfunction of the NBN. But as you say, it's more about getting businesses the education and support that they need. And I guess my key concern there is that all too often a small business or even a medium business comes up against profit taking and comes up against subpar support because the idea is that everybody's working for a buck. We have semi-privatised power, so they're getting gouged at the power plug. We've got a financial industry that is taking far too much profit and is actually admitted at a royal commission to all sorts of dodgy dealings. And I want to make sure that they're getting really reliable and functional support for their industries. And that means, again, education, and that means education available to business owners, available to small business owners, and I'd honestly support like a public education approach to that. I want to use resources like, for instance, the Smart Hub and other areas where we can have learning and training for people without strings attached, because we do know that a lot of small businesses try their best and they don't necessarily get a very good result from the money they're spending. The key to that is to see that as a form of infrastructure and support as opposed to another business. We definitely want people working in the IT industry. I mean, we have people all over the place doing really good work there, but the public and the government needs to provide that support and they need to provide solutions for what people are dealing with. The alternative is that they do their best on Facebook and they're at the mercy of the algorithm, and that's not a very good result. That ties into the discussion we're having about tender processes, promotion, advertising. It's not a level playing field at present. So we want to make sure that businesses are getting good value for their investment into their training and that they get good support. And of course, we want them to have well-educated and capable and skilled people that they can hire to serve those roles as well, definitely.
Okay, Mick, that's the end of the unprepared questions, but we'd like to give you another minute just to summarise your claims and what you're looking for out of this election.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Look, folks, I think it's pretty clear that in the regions we've had some really tough times. And I think it's really impressive and inspiring to see small business owners, farmers and others doing their best and having a lot of ingenuity and a lot of hard work go into their projects. But ultimately, government hasn't been providing them the support they need. Government is far too close to really, really big businesses, multinational corporations and billionaire tycoons. That's not a populist argument, that's the economic reality. We have to push that back. We have to push back the influence they have over the economic system so that small and medium businesses can actually thrive. That's not going to happen if we've always got this expectation that you can't even go through a tender process legitimately or get access to a workforce without having to worry about your workers not being able to take care of their kids, not being able to get their kids off to school and your own kids in the same circumstances. There's a lot of baseline infrastructure that needs to be put in place. The Greens are the only ones that have the plan to do it. We don't take corporate donations from those big businesses, and as a result, we don't have that vested interest. And our policies reflect that. We have the best policies for the regions. We have the best policies to support our economy in earnest. Thank you very much for this time.